A full picture for you this morning. I want first to thank Rachel Yadid and Drora, Arusi. A lot of work you have done, and I brought you also a lot of questions and work, and also to or the nice person who helped me also with the illustration, which in the last moment we just put it in and somehow try to bring it together with the text. So I'm talking about the Jewish communal development under British rule in Aden. Also on a very small, narrow subject, accomplish what Drora talk and others. Oh, I have to talk about it. Yeah. Aden is a British colony. Aden was conquered on January 19, 1839. The military campaign was led by Captain Haynes. 2 ships participated in the operation, including 700 soldiers, of which 400 were Indian soldiers. Captain Haynes was given a hostile Muslim population, a city without infrastructure and services, and an almost paralyzed port. Captain Haynes remained to serve in Aden as governor. Jacob Sapir.
It's good, it's good.
Now it's good.
Jacob Sapir, which arrived in Aden on his way to India, he also drove to Yemen and wrote us a wonderful book about Yemen. He heard from the Jews about the occupation, and the Sultan of Laj demanded that they join him in the war against the British in the attack that took place on Saturday. They refused to desecrate the Shabbat and locked themselves in the synagogue until noon, when the city was flooded with soldiers and occupation was imminent. The British appreciated the neutrality of the Jews and ordered soldiers to be stationed in the synagogue to protect them from the attack of the local loyal to the Sultan. In the census conducted by the British immediately after the occupation, 650 residents were estimated, of which 250 were Jews. Most of them lived in the crater in tents and huts. Captain Haynes decided that there was no other way but to prepare, can you bring the next one please? To prepare a new outline plan for the city that would suit the needs of the large city with a port that would provide services in the future of many ships. The Jews got by the new plan first 7 streets, and then first 4th street, and then they added another 3. The appearance of British with their army men, their families, helpers, doubled the number of the residents from the very first day of the occupation. Supplying food and water to the residents was an existential problem. The success of the occupation depended on solving this problem. The British worked to renovate the large water reservoir called the tanks and prepare it to store large amount of water, and even build new reservoirs. In addition to the resistance, the Muslim resident to the British, the Ottoman army that occupied the coastal area and the Imam's army that fought against them both piled up difficulties on the British. The Jews came to the aid of the British. They made an important contribution to the success of the establishment of the British in Aden. They provided food and water to the British. They knew the location from where to supply fresh food and water even across the border in the Yemen territories. Jewish merchants from Yemen came to their aid too. The British found another important advantage in the Jews. The men knew read and write and calculate. So they were employed in the British offices as bookkeeping and receiving Arabic-speaking audience. The Jews also contributed to the establishment of the British by providing them intelligence information that allowed the British to prepare for the raid of the tribesmen on Aden and the port. Captain Haynes reported to his government in Bombay that he trusted only the Jews in Aden. A solution to the food supply crisis ended when it was decided to compensate the ruler of Lacht for the water taken from the wells in his territory. The British guaranteed political peace from the head of the tribes residing within the border in exchange for protection and the stipend, and thus kept the war away from the city of Aden and the port. Hence was able to settle the dispute over the termination of the border with the ruler of Yemen and the Turkish army by means of agreements which in another time later it was imposed with an operation of the British army. During his reign, Captain Haynes managed to bring the port of Aden to the third most economically important port in the British Empire and the first most important in the Arabian Peninsula. Hundreds of workers from Somalia, Yemen, Hijaz came to work in Aden. Hundreds of construction inspectors and policemen were brought from India. By the years 1870, the infrastructure of the city with proper municipality services had been gradually laid down. A pier and a coal warehouse, duty-free shop, offices representatives of shipping and trading companies, the foreign consulate, and the residential neighborhood for British, non-military personnel, and hotels were built in the area of the old port. There were 3 gates to the enter of the city, and the captain had ordered them to be closed at the sunset to prevent the raiding of the tribes at night into Aden. In the first period of the occupation, Captain Haynes left the Arabs and the Jewish officials to manage the affairs of the port, which were conducted in Hebrew and in Arabic. In 1842, Haynes transferred the administration to officials brought from Bombay. Among the Indians who served in the army and in the government were Bnei Israel Jews from Cochin and Bombay, who arrived usually without their families, served for a few years, and were then replaced by others. Changes in the life of the Jewish community. The British administration did not limit the resident and allow them to choose a profession of source of livelihood as they wish. Every Jew was responsible for his actions, and collective punishment was abolished as in the days of the Sultan. We have also to say that the jizya was abolished for the Jews, and they were not anymore dhimmi under the British. And this was very angry. The Sultan of Lacht was very angry about it because he wanted the jizya money and he wanted also the dhimmi. The secular lifestyle of the British discouraged many, and it took time for them to find their place in the new social order. Sapir made many Jews carrying water, wagoners carrying food and for the army, and among them were also workers in the building and in the port, a day laborer as well. Merchants in shops in the city were many of them Jews in the port area too. The Jews were also allowed to sell alcoholic beverage and even open factories of the production of alcoholic beverage. Until 1850, there were not many changes in way of life of the Jews of Yemen. They did not change their clothes, they did not change their language, and the education of the boys remained as before. Wayman Berry noted that the Jews are actually all in good condition and are influential in the city. With the opening of the Suez Canal in the 60s, the traffic of ships through Aden to Europe increased. The export rate from the Yemen to Aden decreased, but Yemen's dependence on Aden increased. because of the import to Aden went through import to Yemen went through Aden. The introduction of small industrialization in new technologies in production opened doors and opportunities for the Jews of Aden to improve their situation. The Jews of the generation of the British occupation lacked in general education and did not know the method of managing and recording goods and fiscal balances as the British used. Therefore, they concentrated on a small trade, and their influence was evident mainly in the domestic trade. A small number of families managed to integrate into the international trade, led by the Menachem Mesha family. At the same time, Aden's dependence on supplies from Lacht and Yemen weakened, and the bond of the Jews of Aden with their brothers in Yemen also weakened. They were no longer looking for teachers for the children from among the Jews of Yemen, neither they were seeking bridegroom and brides whom they were looking now in Egypt, Israel, and even in Britain. In order to improve their economic and social class situation, the parents encouraged their sons and daughters to expand their education and include general studies in their curriculum. The youth acquired an education in school run by the British, but in Aden and or in academic institution in Bombay. Some specialized professions such as law or accountants. The younger generation mastered the English language. Some of them turned to work for the British in services and clerical work. Craftsmen were hardly found among them. Sapir noted that the changes began already 10 years after the occupation. Hunter wrote in the 1960s, and Tzemach, 50 years later, said that there were no craftsmen left among the Jews in Aden anymore. Indian craftsmen replaced the traditional local goldsmith. Already the first years of the occupation, the British invested in the education of the local residents. They aimed to prepare a generation of leaders for their communities and also to replace the Indian bureaucracy with local workers. Until the 80s of the 19th century, there were educational workshops run by the Jewish and the Muslim community. In 1856, the British opened a school for the residents of Aden. The teacher came from India and taught English and arithmetic. There were this was for 2 years. 20 students were enrolled at this school, including 2 Jews. In 1866, the British established a college for the study of general studies with 5 years of free study for the entire population. The school was called Aden Residency School, and 3 out of 60 students were Jewish. The top 24 students were accepted to work as officials in the British administration. The others were incorporated into trading agencies and shipping companies. When a school for girls was opened by the Scottish Mission in 1860, a dispute arose among the Jewish community about whether to send the girl to the Christian school. And the president of the community, Menachem Mesha, ruled that a 2 years education would benefit the girls. In 1897, 1,768 students studied in all the educational institutions. Among them were 88 Jews. Menachem Mesha worked hard to integrate children into the government schools. During his visit to Aden, Shmuel Yavnieli warned that there was no really standard good Hebrew school at Aden. As a result, which 20 boys were studying in school in the Scottish Mission and about 20 girls by the Jesuits. In 1905, Menachem Mesha applied to the British authorities in Aden for permission to lease land to build schools. Permission had been granted for 99 years in exchange of 25,000 rupees. The school opened in 1912. The association, Anglo-Jewish Association in London, accompanied the educational work there. When the Prince of Wales, later King George V, visited Aden in 1921, the Jewish school was renamed after him. The prince had led, there are photos of it which we saw yesterday, by the way, led in the inauguration himself, which was a well-attended ceremony. The school's name had been changed thereby to King George School for the Jews. The Jews were recognized by the British as a minority that could autonomously manage its affairs according to its religion and tradition. The government of Aden issued an explicit order that Jewish marriage would only be recognized if they were conducted by the rabbis of the court. Civil matters, such as buying or selling or goods and leases, were handled by the licensed lawyer. When needed arose, they turned to a court in Aden, and in the case of appeals against the verdict, they were heard in a court of the law in Bombay. At the beginning of the 20th century, changes were evidenced the lifestyle and appearance of the Jews. At first, the men imitated clothing style of the Indian Jews, wearing light clothes, white, often a long shirt and white pants. After the First World War, mainly the young people adopted the European British clothing style, jacket and trousers, and among the signs of the progress, it can also be noted that the young people also signed up for the British social clubs and played tennis and volleyball, ball, and this option was open to boys and girls, and there was a football club for Jews. The immigration of the Jews from Yemen to Aden contributed to the strengthening of the Jewish community in the first decade of the occupation. The Jews of Aden treated the Jews of Yemen as brothers. Many of them were waiting in Aden for entry permit for the Eretz Israel office, and in the meantime worked for their livelihood and also saved money for the cheap ship ticket. Until the 1930, the Jews of Aden are fondly remembered for this, having received the hundreds of Jewish immigrants from Yemen with hospitality and generosity. Now a few words about all the... Okay. Only few words about it. When the British replanted the old city and built stone houses, for reason that many tombstones were discovered in the area, and that probably once part of the Jewish quarter cemetery. Brigadier Playfair, who supervised the construction of the operation of the tombstones that were good in condition, moved to the administration and later to the British Museum. And when the archaeological museum was opened in the 30s in Aden, they were also brought from the office and the other old tombstones. The epitaphs are today on the courtyard in open air on the floor, a 2,000 years old epitaph. If you can show it there, and you see there, and they are all dated according to Ashtarot, the calendar of the documents. And you know the Ashtarot document is from the Alexander Mukdon dating. So 2,000 years, and it was a discussion of they are really 2,000 years, or they omitted the hay, the 5,000 for the calendar to do it. Thank you very much.